Okay, here we're going to be talking about the topic of drug addiction, and we may think of that as being synthetic drugs or legal drugs. Keep in mind this cup of coffee has caffeine, and this can also be considered or classified as a drug. Drugs in general, we're looking at their neuromodulators, which are chemicals that prolong the effect of neurotransmitters by either aiding in their release or preventing their reabsorption. For an example, depression may be caused by a shortage of serotonin. Prozac inhibits that reabsorption. So here we are in kind of the synapse here with Prozac inhibiting the reabsorption of that serotonin molecule there. Again, acting as a neuromodulator. Drug addiction in general, cells that are exposed to chemical signals for a prolonged time lose their sensitivity. So what does this mean, this sensitivity? Well, they lose their ability to respond to the stimulus with the original intensity. So while we may have a normal kind of going on here, where we've got releasing, we've got in that synapse here, that gap between the two neurons, we've got that interaction occurring. However, here we see that nerve cells are particularly prone to the loss of this sensitivity. And what does that look on a molecular scale? If we look at the arrow here pointing to this kind of receptor, we can see those molecules are free to move through this kind of protein here. That protein is being blocked. So this is a change in the way the body is perceiving or releasing and absorbing, in this case, serotonin. So this leaves more serotonin to float around in that synapse. Typically, cells will respond to high neurotransmitter exposure by inserting fewer protein receptors. So we're having this altered protein receptor amount which is ultimately altering the amount of neurotransmitters left in that synapse. And we can see over time how this addiction occurs, usually not just once, occurs over time because there is this change or this shift in the actual protein receptors. Cocaine, as an example here, addiction occurs with chronic exposure to a drug that induces the nervous system to act in a physiological way. Cocaine is a neuromodulator. It causes large amounts of neurotransmitters to remain in the synapse for a long period of time. So kind of what we saw in the previous image, this is just an example of a drug that does perform in that way. Dopamine transmits pleasure messages to the body, and high levels for long periods can cause nerve cells to lower the number of receptors. And this is why typically cocaine users need to use more and more to get the same effect. Sadly, through just one use, or definitely if you're increasing the dose, that increases the odds of dying from cocaine. We can see, sadly, this number of deaths from cocaine comparing males to females over a number of years. Now, THC, the psychoactive drug found in cannabis plants, which makes it classified as marijuana. It mimics another neurotransmitter that we have in our body, causing effects to the body. Those effects would be increased sensory intensity of perceived sensory data. Well, what does that kind of mean? It kind of gives the sense of emotional well-being and reduced concentration or impaired judgment of both time and space. How it kind of works on a molecular level here is normally we have our cells that may produce inhibitory neurotransmitters. They're represented here by the little blue triangles. They prevent dopamine secretion. However, here we're having this block of those inhibitory neurotransmitters. It's inhibiting the inhibitors. As a result, the dopamine is being released and binds to the receptors here. We're having this kind of a loss of regulation. Well, what THC does is it mimics that same kind of molecular shape and fits into that same receptor, causing the same effect. However, in this case with the green, we're having a natural balance is occurring. In this case, we're having an artificial occurrence, which is causing that impaired judgment of time and space and that feeling of emotional well-being. Then we get to tobacco, which is involved with nicotine receptors. They normally serve to bind acetylcholine. The brain adjusts to prolonged exposure of nicotine by making fewer nicotine receptors and altering the pattern of activation of those nicotine receptors. So we're having a change in the physiological response and also a reduction in the total receptors. Addiction occurs because the brain experiences nicotine-induced changes to protein expression in the synaptic connections. There's no real easy way to quit. The only way to quit is to quit. And of course, that's easier said than done. Lastly, looking at nicotine, it's a natural insecticide produced by the tobacco plant. So the tobacco plant's actually producing nicotine to help prevent it from insect damage. Synthetic forms of nicotine have been produced. They're called nicotinoids, and they are potential risks to reduce bee populations. However, their use across the country is quite extensive, so we're having this particular insecticide being spread over large areas. So that's a concern with anything where we potentially could get resistance built up to that or damage to our very important bee pollinators.